The wolf's howl was the first sound that felt like a kindness. It was a clean and honest sound in a world that had become a muffled nightmare of white. Elara lay where her father had thrown her from the wagon, a discarded thing in the vast, uncaring snow. The cold had already stolen the feeling from her feet, a thief so quiet she hadn't noticed its work until it was done. Her cheek was frozen to the icy crust of the ground, and each breath was a plume of white vapor, a ghost of the life still flickering inside her. They had called her barren, a curse, a worthless mouth to feed, now that her mother was gone, and the deal for her marriage was all that mattered. A deal she had apparently ruined. She saw the ghost of her father's face, his eyes as hard and grey as the winter sky. "No daughter of mine will shame me," he had spat, his words lost to the wind that immediately began its work, burying her. She was a problem he was solving with snow and silence. The wind carried the last of the wagon's sounds away, leaving her utterly alone. Despair was a weight heavier than the snow that was beginning to drift over her legs. It was a final, crushing blanket. But as the wolf howled again, closer this time, a strange and terrible thought broke through the numbness. She would rather be torn apart by a beast than fade away under the cold, quiet judgment of the snow. At least the wolf was honest in its hunger. It was a more honorable end than the one her own blood had chosen for her. A wet, warm nose suddenly nudged her frozen cheek, and a low whine cut through the wind. It was not a wolf. She tried to lift her head, but her muscles were stone. A massive, dark shape blotted out the grey sky, its breath warm on her face. A dog, a creature of impossible warmth in her world of ice. And then a voice, deep and rough, cut through the storm. "Zeus, what have you found, boy?" The sound of that voice was like a crack of lightning in her dying mind. She had been left for dead by a man who was supposed to love her, only to be found by a stranger. Was this a crueler trick of fate, or the last, desperate beat of a heart that refused to stop? If this is already breaking your heart, you haven't seen the last of their cruelty. Tap subscribe. The world tilted and then went dark. Not the cold darkness of the snow, but a darkness wrapped in the scent of pine, leather, and the surprising warmth of a living animal. Before that moment, before the snow became her tomb, her life had been a series of shrinking rooms. After her mother's death, her world, once filled with the scent of baking bread and quiet songs, had contracted to the four walls of the kitchen, then to the silent confines of her own bedroom. Her father, Silas, and her two older brothers, Marcus and Luke, moved through the house like shadows with heavy boots, their grief curdling into a hard, practical cruelty. Elara was a loose thread in the fabric of their new, stark reality. The arrangement had been made a year prior, a pact between her father and the formidable rancher to the west, Caleb Ryder. It was a joining of lands, a consolidation of power sealed with a daughter. Elara had never met the man, had only heard the whispers, that he was quiet, that he was solitary, that his lands were vast and his reputation unshakable. She was to be his bride. It was a fate she accepted with the weary resignation that had become her only companion. But a month before the wedding, the town doctor, a nervous man with shifting eyes, had delivered a private verdict to her father. After a fever had swept through their home, leaving Elara weak for weeks, he declared her unlikely to ever bear children. A barren field, a broken vessel. The words echoed in Silas's study, and Elara, listening from the hall, felt the last warmth drain from her life. The deal was compromised. The value she held was gone. Her father's ambition, however, remained. He would not be shamed. He would not have Caleb Ryder reject his daughter and, by extension, his name. So they concocted a story. They told the neighbors Elara was flighty, heartbroken over some secret lover, and had run away in the night, spurning the honorable match. They loaded a wagon with supplies, as if for a long journey. But they took her only to the edge of the northern wilderness, to a place where the winter was deepest and no traveler ever went. "You have made your bed," her father said, his voice flat and devoid of all emotion, as he pushed her into the snowbank. "Now lie in it." Her brothers did not look at her. They simply turned the wagon and drove away, leaving the silence to swallow her whole. That was where the cold began its work. That was where she prepared to die. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a series of painful jolts. First, there was the feeling of being carried. She was weightless, cradled against a wall of solid muscle and coarse wool that smelled of the outdoors. The wind was still a roar, but it was distant now, muffled by the sheer size of the man who held her. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were fused with ice. A low rumble, a voice, vibrated through her. "Just hold on, almost there." She did not know if she could. Holding on required a strength she no longer possessed. Hope had been chased out of her body, leaving only a hollow ache. This man, this stranger, was a phantom. His warmth was a lie, her dying brain was telling itself. Yet the warmth was undeniable. It seeped through her frozen layers, a tiny, insistent seed of heat in the permafrost of her soul. The next thing she knew, the roaring wind was gone, replaced by a profound, crackling quiet. The smell of pine and leather was stronger, now mingled with the sharp, clean scent of wood smoke. She was being laid down on something soft, a bearskin rug, its fur thick and deep. A massive dog, the one from the storm, padded over and laid its heavy head on her legs, a living, breathing weight of reassurance. Its presence was a tether to the world of the living. The man moved with a quiet, efficient grace. She could hear the clink of metal, the slosh of water. He did not speak. His actions were his language. He was cutting away her frozen clothes, his movements deft and impersonal. She felt no shame, only a distant awareness of the care he was taking. He wrapped her in heavy wool blankets, piling them on until she was cocooned. Then he gently lifted her head and pressed a warm cup to her lips. It was broth, salty and rich, and the heat that spread through her chest was the most profound sensation she had ever known. It was life. It was a direct contradiction to the death her father had wished upon her. She finally managed to pry her eyes open. He was a silhouette against the fire, tall and broad-shouldered. The flames cast dancing shadows across a face that was all harsh angles and rugged planes, framed by dark hair damp with melted snow. His eyes, when he turned to look at her, were the color of a stormy sky, but they held no malice. They held a kind of weary assessment, a quiet intensity. He was studying her, not with judgment, but with a raw, searching curiosity. Who was she? What tragedy had thrown her into the path of his storm? He saw the flicker of awareness in her eyes and nodded slightly, as if to himself. "You're safe now," he said. The words were simple, factual. He offered them not as a promise, but as a statement of current reality. In this cabin, with the fire roaring and the storm raging outside, she was safe. He asked no questions. He did not demand to know her name or her story. He simply tended to the fire, moved back to his chair, and watched over her, his massive dog, a silent sentinel, at her feet. For the first time in months, a human presence felt like a shield, not a threat. Exhaustion, deep and absolute, finally claimed her, pulling her into a dreamless, healing sleep. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the single cabin window. Her world was reduced to the crackle of the fire, the taste of broth and stew, the heavy warmth of the blankets, and the silent, watchful presence of the man and his dog. He called the dog Zeus, a name that seemed fitting for the creature's noble bearing. He never told her his own name. He didn't need to. In the quiet language of their shared space, he was simply her rescuer. Her body healed slowly, painfully. The frostbite on her hands and feet receded from a terrifying black to a bruised purple, then to a tender, angry red. He tended to her wounds with an astonishing gentleness, his large, calloused hands applying salves with the focus of a craftsman. He never flinched from the task. He never showed disgust. He simply did what needed to be done. His silence was a gift. It allowed her own silence to be something other than a weakness. It was a space to heal, free from the burden of explanation or justification. The questions her father and brothers had never asked, but had answered for her, hung in the air of her memory. Why are you not like your mother? Why can you not give me a grandson? What use are you? Here, in this cabin, there were no questions. There was only the steady rhythm of survival. She began to watch him. He moved with a purpose that was deeply ingrained. Whether he was splitting wood, cleaning his rifle, or kneading dough for bread. His solitude was not one of loneliness, but of self-sufficiency. This small, sturdy cabin was his kingdom, and he was its quiet, capable ruler. He was everything her father pretended to be, strong, not with bluster, but with a core of solid, unmovable integrity. One afternoon, as he sat cleaning a harness, his brow furrowed in concentration, she spoke for the first time. Her voice was a dry, rasping thing, unused and afraid. Ilara. He stilled, his hands pausing their work. He looked up at her, his stormy eyes unreadable. He waited. My name, she whispered, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. It's Ilara. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. Caleb, he said, his voice a low rumble. Caleb Ryder. The name struck her like a physical blow. Caleb Ryder, the man from the whispers, the rancher, her promised groom, the man she had supposedly jilted. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the fragile peace she had found. He thought she had run from him, humiliated him. If he knew the whole truth, would this kindness curdle into contempt? Would he see her as her father did, a flawed, broken thing? You felt that, didn't you? The moment the floor fell out from under her world again. Subscribe. I promise you, his reaction is not what you expect. She wanted to explain, to tell him everything, but the words caught in her throat. Fear was a gag, silencing her once more. He must have seen the terror in her eyes, the way she shrank back into the blankets. He set the harness aside and rose, moving not toward her, but to the hearth. He stirred the fire, his back to her, giving her space. Rest, Ilara, he said, his voice even betraying nothing. You're still weak. His reaction was nothing. He did not press her. He did not rage. He simply accepted her name and continued his quiet care. It was a mercy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She wept silently into the wool blankets, not from sorrow, but from a strange and painful gratitude. He was a good man, a man who judged on action, not on rumor. And for now, that was enough. The bond between them shifted. It was no longer just survivor and rescuer. It was Ilara and Caleb. Two names spoken aloud in a quiet room, carrying more weight than either of them yet understood. As her strength returned, the silence between them began to fill with small things. She started to help, at first just folding blankets or stirring the stew. Soon, she was kneading bread alongside him, their hands dusted with the same flour, moving in a comfortable rhythm. He taught her how to stitch leather, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to set a snare. He spoke more, telling her stories of the mountains, of the habits of deer, and the fury of a winter storm. He spoke of his ranch, of the horses he treasured, of the deep satisfaction of working the land. He never spoke of a runaway bride. He never spoke of the deal made between their fathers. He treated her as if her past began the moment Zeus found her in the snow. It was a deliberate, gentle erasing of whatever life she had before, and she was grateful for it. She began to feel a sense of belonging that she had never known, not even in her own family's home. Here, her worth was measured in her resilience, in her quiet willingness to learn, in the simple fact of her presence. Hope, once a foreign country, became a familiar landscape. She found herself smiling at the way Zeus would sigh in his sleep. She felt a lightness in her chest when Caleb would look at her across the fire, a flicker of something warm and protective in his gaze. She was not just a survivor. She was beginning to live. The cabin was no longer a temporary shelter. It was becoming a home. This fragile peace was shattered on a morning when the winter sun finally showed its face, casting a brilliant, blinding glare across the snow. A sound, faint at first, then growing steadily louder, reached the cabin, the sound of horses and men's voices. Zeus rose to his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Caleb was instantly alert, moving to the window, his body tense. Elara's blood ran cold. She knew those voices. She knew the sharp, commanding tone of her father, Silas, the rougher, crueler cadence of her brothers. They had found her. The past she had been allowed to forget had come crashing back. "Stay away from the window," Caleb ordered, his voice flat and hard. He turned from the window, his face a mask of grim understanding. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the pieces clicking into place. Elara, the daughter of Silas, the woman he was supposed to marry, the woman who had run away. He had rescued his own promised bride without ever knowing it. "They were tracking a lost herd," he said, his voice dangerously low. "Or so they'll claim. They've been searching the low country for weeks." His gaze held hers, and it was filled not with the accusation she dreaded, but with a dawning, terrible comprehension. He wasn't looking at a runaway. He was looking at a survivor. He was looking at the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. Why would a woman flee into a blizzard? The answer was standing before him, pale and trembling. She wouldn't, unless she was not fleeing, but being driven. "Elara," he said, and her name was a vow. "They will not take you." The fear that had gripped her was suddenly met with a new, unfamiliar feeling, a surge of defiant anger, not just for herself, but for him. For this quiet man who had shown her more kindness in a few weeks than her family had in a lifetime. They had lied to him. They had used her supposed shame to cover their own monstrous cruelty. The pounding on the door was like a hammer against her heart. "Ryder!" It was her father's voice, booming and arrogant. "We know you're in there. We've had word a woman was seen in your company. A woman matching my daughter's description. The daughter who shamed us both." Caleb moved to stand in front of her, a human shield. He didn't open the door. He simply stood there, a mountain of silent resolve. He was giving them a chance to leave, a chance they would not take. "Open this door, Ryder, or we'll break it down. She's my blood. She's my property to deal with." Property. The word was a slap. It broke through the last of her fear. She stepped out from behind Caleb, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was clear and steady, ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I am not your property," she said, her words carrying through the thick wood of the door. Outside, there was a stunned silence. Then, her father's voice, laced with venom. "So, the little mouse found her tongue. And a protector. It doesn't matter. You are coming with us. You will not ruin the family name further by shacking up with this hermit." Caleb's hand rested on the heavy bar securing the door. He looked at Elara, a question in his eyes. It was not asking for permission. It was an offer of alliance. Together? Her nod was sharp, decisive. He lifted the bar. The door swung open to reveal the three of them, Silas and her brothers, Marcus and Luke. Their faces were a mixture of shock, fury, and contempt as they saw her standing there, alive and defiant. They had expected to find a cowering, shamed girl. They found a woman standing beside a man who looked like he was carved from the mountain itself. "So," Silas sneered, his eyes flicking from Caleb to Elara. The story is true. You ran from your obligation straight into this man's bed. You have less honor than I thought." "She ran from nothing." Caleb's voice was low, a rumble of thunder before a storm. "I found her in the snow, half dead, where you left her." The accusation hung in the cold air, stark and ugly. Marcus and Luke shifted uncomfortably, but Silas's face hardened into a mask of righteous indignation. "Lies! She is a liar and a runaway. She is coming home. We will deal with her disgrace in private." He took a step forward, his hand outstretched to grab her arm. Before he could touch her, Caleb moved. It wasn't a fast movement, but it was absolute. He simply stepped in front of Elara, blocking her completely. His presence was a wall. "She is not going anywhere," Caleb stated. It was not a debate. It was a fact. "This is not your concern, Ryder," Marcus snarled, stepping up beside his father. "This is a family matter. You made it my concern when you left my intended bride to die in a blizzard." Caleb shot back, his voice cutting like ice. "You made it my concern when you lied to me and to the entire valley. You wanted an alliance of our lands. You wanted my name connected to yours. But you tried to bury the part of the bargain you deemed worthless." That word worthless struck Silas like a physical blow. It was the truth of his heart, spoken aloud by a stranger. His face purpled with rage. "She is barren. She is of no use to you or anyone. She is a stain on my honor." That was it. That was the moment everything broke. For Elara, hearing the ugly, secret reason for her exile, spoken so crudely in front of the one man who had shown her value, something inside her snapped. She stepped around Caleb, her eyes blazing with a fire that eclipsed the hearth behind her. This man, her father, would not define her, not anymore. "Subscribe. The courage you are about to witness is earned in fire and ice. My worth is not for you to decide," she said, her voice shaking but strong. "You speak of honor, but you left your own daughter to freeze to death to save your pathetic pride. You are the one with no honor. You are the stain." For a breathless second, no one moved. Silas stared at her, his mouth agape, utterly stunned by her defiance. He had never seen this woman before. The quiet, obedient girl was gone, replaced by this fierce creature born of snow and survival. Then his shock curdled back into rage. He lunged, not for her, but for Caleb, a wordless roar erupting from his throat. It was a foolish, desperate move. Caleb met his charge not with anger, but with a cold, efficient force. He sidestepped Silas's clumsy attack, caught his arm, and used his own momentum to send him stumbling into the snowdrift beside the porch. Marcus and Luke surged forward together, but they were no match for a man who lived and breathed the harsh realities of this land. Caleb moved with the brutal economy of a predator. He disabled Luke with a single, precise blow that sent him gasping to his knees. Marcus hesitated, his eyes wide with fear, and Caleb simply stared him down. The fight was over before it had truly begun. Caleb stood over her father, who was sputtering in the snow, his face a mask of humiliation. "Get up," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm. "Get your sons, and get off my land. If I ever see you near her again, the snow will be the last of your worries." Silas scrambled to his feet, his arrogance shattered, replaced by a venomous hatred. He looked at Elara, his eyes promising a future retribution he was powerless to enact. "You are dead to me," he hissed. "I have been dead to you for a long time," she replied, her voice steady. "I am glad you finally realize it." He herded his beaten sons before him, and they retreated, their figures shrinking against the vast white expanse until they were gone. The silence they left behind was profound. It was the silence of victory, of a battle fought and won. Elara stood on the porch, the cold air sharp in her lungs, and did not feel the chill. She was looking at the empty landscape where her past had just vanished. Caleb came to stand beside her. He didn't touch her. but his presence was a warmth that wrapped around her more surely than any blanket. "The arrangement our fathers made," he said quietly, his gaze on the horizon. "It means nothing, not anymore." She turned to look at him, her heart aching with a mixture of relief and a new, more tender fear. "I know. What they did to you," he started, his jaw tight with a fury he had held in check. "There is no forgiveness for that." He finally looked at her, his stormy eyes searching hers. "But I want you to know, my home is your home. For as long as you want it, there are no deals here. No bargains. Just this." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, the mountains, the quiet space between them. Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they were not from sorrow or fear. They were from a hope so fierce it hurt. "They thought I was worthless because I could not give them a family," she whispered, laying her deepest shame bare. Caleb reached out then, his calloused fingers gently touching her cheek. His touch was not one of possession, but of reverence. "A family is not just about blood," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's about who you stand with when the storm comes, who you fight for." He let his hand fall, but his eyes held her fast. "I choose to stand with you, Ilara." In that moment, a new arrangement was made, not of land or of pride, but of two solitary souls choosing to face the world together. She took a step closer to him, into the circle of his warmth, and laid her head against his chest. She could hear the strong, steady beat of his heart. It was the sound of her future, the sound of home. A year passed. The seasons turned, painting the valley in the vibrant greens of spring, the dusty golds of summer, and the fiery reds of autumn, before surrendering once more to the pristine white of winter. But this winter was different. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a sanctuary filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Ilara and Caleb were married in the spring, in a quiet ceremony under the ancient pine tree that stood sentinel over the cabin. The only witnesses were Zeus and the vast, silent mountains. Caleb had slipped a simple, hand-carved wooden ring onto her finger. It was worth more to her than all the gold her father possessed. Her past was a ghost that rarely visited. Word had trickled in from town that Silas and his sons had sold their land at a loss and moved east, their reputation in tatters after the story of their cruelty, whispered by a chastened town doctor, had taken root. They were gone. Justice had been a quiet, slow-moving thing, but it had arrived. Ilara found her purpose, not in fulfilling an old bargain, but in building a new life. She had a gift for healing, for nurturing. The garden she planted that spring flourished under her care. The orphaned colt Caleb had brought home, despairing of its survival, thrived under her patient hand. She discovered a strength in herself that was rooted in compassion, not compliance. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, she sat by the fire, mending one of Caleb's shirts. He sat across from her, oiling a rifle, the movements familiar and comforting. Zeus snored at his feet. The domestic peace was so profound, so complete, that it still sometimes took her breath away. Caleb looked up, his work forgotten, and simply watched her. A slow smile touched his lips, a rare and precious thing that made her heart sing. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. He set the rifle aside. "I was thinking about the day Zeus found you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I cursed the storm that day. I was wrong. It was the storm that brought you to me." She put down her sewing and went to him, kneeling on the rug beside his chair. She took his large, work-roughened hand in hers. "You carried me," she whispered, the memory still vivid. "You carried me home. Always," he said, his voice thick with unspoken emotion. He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, then held it against his cheek. Always. They had not been blessed with a child of their own, and the doctor's words had proven true. But the hollowness her father had tried to carve into her soul had been filled to overflowing. It was filled with the love of a good man, the loyalty of a noble dog, and the deep, abiding peace of a home forged in a blizzard and tempered by courage. She had been left for dead in the snow, a barren field discarded by her own blood. But here, in the arms of the man who was once a stranger, she had blossomed. Her life was not a tragedy to be endured, but a testament to the fact that true family is not always the one you are born into, but the one you build, the one you fight for, the one that carries you home.